Everyone, I'd like to welcome you to the Victory Gardening webinar that's in partnership with the Town of Okotoks and the Okotoks Gardening Club. Could you go to the next slide, please, Susie? So I am Roisin, and I'm a project assistant with the Environment and Sustainability Department at the Town of Okotoks. And with me here tonight, I have Susan Russell, who is the Okotoks Gardening Club president. Susan, would you like to say a few words?
Sure, I would love to. So Happy New Year to you all and welcome. The Okotoks Garden Club and the Town of Okotoks is once more collaborating on various gardening topics. So this winter and spring, we're offering 4 sessions, January through April. Today on Victory Gardening, February, how to create super soil in which to grow those wonderful vegetables. March, water-wise gardening. And April, how to grow alpine perennial flowers, which are native to our region, which means they can take anything the weather gives them, very easy to grow and drought tolerant. Wonderful little plants. As for tonight's session, Victory Gardening, I would like to present my dear husband, Colin, who learned to grow vegetables in Alberta over the past 40 years. Now, born a Brit, it is in the genes to start with, but all he learned about growing vegetables, he actually did learn here and not at home in England. So hopefully in this session, if you're an experienced gardener, there's always something new to learn in gardening. And if you're a novice gardener, you will learn how easy it can be. If you just follow a few tips that Colin will have for you, you'll be surprised at how successful it'll be. Anyway, enjoy everybody, and I will move over and leave Colin to take over.
Hi, as Sue said, I'm a practical gardener, experienced over the past 40 years, mainly in northern Alberta. I'm certainly an avid gardener these days. My 2 passions are certainly growing roses and tomatoes, but I also grow a variety of vegetables every year. I have a couple of community plots outside of town, and they're where I spend a lot of my time. So tonight, as we go through, we will have some question and answer function that you can use on your screen to write questions, and they'll be managed by Roisin. And as I'm going through and flipping the slides, and I'm finishing each slide, I'll ask if there are any questions, just to let me know, especially if I've missed a particular vegetable that you wanted to cover, because I certainly can't cover every vegetable this evening. And as Roisin, I think, will say, the presentation will be recorded and uploaded, right, on YouTube.
Yes. Yep. Yeah, we will record the presentation tonight, and then I believe Susan will be able to send it out to all of the gardening club members after it's up, and then everyone else can check it out on the Okotoks.ca website. So to kick us off, I will just launch a little poll here, see if it works. All right, so the question is, where does the term victory garden come from? Pretty easy question, I think. All right, I'll give people 5 more seconds if they want to answer. Okay, and yeah, so victory gardening did come from wartime, World War I and II, and the government kind of promoted them to supplement rations as well as boost morale during the war. So I think, yeah, victory gardening has kind of come back into our repertoire these days, just with the pandemic and everything. I know a lot of people are gardening that haven't before. So hopefully this presentation will be super helpful to all of you. And with that, I will stop talking and go ahead, Colin.
Thanks. Thank you. So that should make my introduction of this quite a bit easier. So I can just give you a poll. All right, so victory gardening. I'm going to try and focus on, hopefully I'm focused on vegetable gardening during a pandemic, so there should be no difficulties with maintaining social distance as you garden. But the presentation this evening will focus on practical gardening suggestions for what I refer to as easy, productive, low maintenance vegetables. Oopsie-daisy. And the benefits of certainly of growing your own vegetables is you get to enjoy the fruits of your labor and to share with family, friends, and neighbors, which is certainly a bonus. So the one thing that I will say is that when I was busy reading and referencing many gardening books and journals, the definition of easy to grow is certainly differs, and it differs in the location of the world that the books are written in. So it makes a huge difference if you're referencing something that's in the Pacific Northwest or south of the border in the States, here in Alberta, or even in Ontario and other northern climes. What is relatively easy here may be difficult somewhere else because of climate, because of pests and diseases that may be prevalent in those particular areas. So if you're ever buying books, and I make some references at the end of here, do check into to get books that are local in terms of reference books. It's not to say that those books, other books, aren't helpful, but definitely what is easy to grow here may not be as easy elsewhere. So some of the the benefits in the vegetables I'll be covering here will be good quality common vegetables that I think most of us will know. They're less fussy in terms of how they grow, less prone to pests and diseases, and what I refer to as low maintenance. And maintenance growing a vegetable garden is basically weeding and water and then harvest. And yes, there's maybe a little bit of fertilizer at the beginning there, a bit more often on some particular plants. And hopefully I can explain in some detail. Not included in a lot of detail is the soil preparation and fertilizing. As Sue just mentioned, Mike Dorian will be talking about that. He is the soil expert in the Calgary region and highly used by the Calgary Hort Society and a very good resource. I do have a slide on composting very briefly, but that was the main theme of one of our fall presentations by Elaine Rood that is, I believe, available on YouTube if you want to go and look at that. And I won't be talking an awful lot about planning your garden. I'm just going to say grow what you like to eat and to try to also avoid an awful lot of waste as well. But it does make a lot of sense to put some effort into planning the garden that you're going to grow at the very early stages. So there we go. What is a little victory garden? So as Roisin sort of kindly helped us into this, and it does a lot of my work for me. Yeah, it started in Britain in the beginning of World War I. And revived itself again during World War II. And in fact, almost all the countries that were in those world wars had some level of victory gardening campaigns in their countries. It was clearly designed to address food shortages. caused by the interrupted supply chain, but also an awful lot of farm labor in those days had actually then left and gone into the wars. So there was a real shortage of labor available. And so by encouraging folks left at home to grow vegetables, it left them with the feeling that they could support the war effort in, even though they were still at home, and help their community and help their neighbors, and also be rewarded by the produce that they grew themselves. And nearly every spare patch of land, certainly in Britain, but in many places, was used to grow food. So golf courses were stripped up, churchyards, playgrounds, parks. Even today, if you go into Britain, an awful lot of allotments, so we would call community gardens here, are still along the side of railway lines. It's waste ground, but they were turned into gardening endeavors during the World Wars. So even window boxes and doorstep containers were used. To give you a little bit of stats as to how the impact of this victory gardening did. In the US, 18 million people participated in victory gardening, and they grew almost 40% of all of the food consumed within the States. And it left the commercial growers and farmers to focus their efforts on growing basically to feed the troops, and a lot of that was shipped abroad. So just a little bit of background. The unintended or unexpected outcome of all of this was the boost to civilian morale. Growing a victory garden was seen as a patriotic duty, especially here in Canada. As I said earlier, it was a way of being able to contribute. In 2020, I think we all know there was some initial anxiety and worry about the food supply, and it drove a huge increase in the interest in growing your own food, and specifically growing your own vegetables. It's something you can do for yourself and your family and your community. It helps to ease anxiety because you're now taking some action to address areas of concern. So it reduces your stress and results in the immense satisfaction when you reap the rewards of your efforts. And I've got to say, even after 40 years of growing my own food, growing some of it, I still get an immense amount of satisfaction when I pick my carrots and potatoes and beets at the end of at harvest time. It's still very, very enjoyable. And for those in case that you might be thinking, that is not a picture of me on the right-hand side, either in World War I or World War II. No, I'm not that old. So in 2020, just like toilet paper and hand sanitizer, garden plants and seeds were in huge demand. The garden sellers and the seed sellers were swamped with new demands. Growing vegetables on Google was up 4,500+%. And Burpee, which is probably one of the largest American seed sellers, had more requests and sold more seeds last year than in any year of its 144-year history. And seeds are already in high demand in 2021. So the timing tonight of hopefully giving you some ideas of what to grow this year, I think is pretty much ideal, but it doesn't leave you an awful lot of time to be contacting some of the seed sellers. And anybody can become a gardener. It just takes a little practice, a little patience, and the ability to learn from mistakes. I used to say I never made any mistakes, but I've made few these days, and Sue will tell you I've got immense patience. I'm renowned for it. Only that was true. So if I can garden, I'm pretty much certain that most people can garden. I'm going to quickly go over just some brief benefits of growing your own veggies. Certainly it's going to stretch your food budget a little bit. You're going to certainly develop a greater appreciation of the food you eat and the satisfaction of providing for yourselves. It's just terrific. And generally, the foods that you grow at home have more flavor. And primarily because those that we eat and buy, certainly in our local supermarkets, are generally grown for uniform shape and size and how well and travel they keep. Especially if you're getting things that have been grown in California and being shipped up here. And there's a chance to try some different vegetables and varieties that maybe you haven't tried before. So, white and golden and striped beets are a good example. Golden zucchini, white, purple, and yellow carrots. And I know these days there's an awful lot of them are available maybe through farmers markets, but we don't always have the luxury of being able to access them as easily. Certainly they're, I'll say more environmentally friendly. You've got the confidence that you haven't put any harmful chemicals that are sprayed on your vegetables, whether they're, herbicides or pesticides or anything. And generally, I don't use any chemicals at all on my vegetables. And the exercise that you get from being outside, fresh air, moderate physical activity is certainly good for you. As I said earlier, it helps to relieve some stress, and the physical outside work certainly improves sleep quality. When I was looking this up in preparation for it, I came across a number of surveys and statistics, and the BBC have a web theme called 100-Year Life, and their title is "Gardening Could Be the Hobby That Helps You Live to Be 100. The combination of outdoor lifestyle, moderate physical activity, and less stress." And there are numerous studies that support that all around the world. And a recent study that they referenced is that Australian researchers following men and women in their 60s found that those who regularly garden had a 36% lower risk of dementia than their non-gardening counterparts. Hey, so what's there not to like about a little bit of gardening? I did want to just mention that don't let lack of space deter you. No matter how much room you have, you can grow vegetables in your own backyard, your front garden, on a balcony, on a patio. A 10 by 10 lot can grow a tremendous amount of food, of vegetables, and inquire about a community garden. I don't have a lot of space on my small, typical suburban property, but I grow a lot of vegetables in my community plots. Yes, I do grow a couple. I have a small greenhouse here, and I do grow my tomatoes and cucumbers there, but most of my vegetables are grown on the community garden. And the photograph on the left there is a really good example of you can grow almost anything in containers. They just need to be big enough depending on what you're growing. All right, so these are my definitions of easy to grow, low maintenance vegetables. As I said earlier, I'm sure people will have different opinions, and this is what I will be covering in a bit more detail. I'll go through each one of these specifically. So if you think I'm missing something, now's the time just to put it in the question and answers and send Roisin a quick email, and I'll certainly a text, and I'll certainly try to answer them at the very end here. And I do go into a lot more detail here. But before we get to that, we've got to talk about some fundamentals. And some of those are you're basically going to start with either growing from seed or seedlings transplants. There's really three types. There's seeds, seedlings, and then sets. But I'll talk about the sets as I get into a bit more detail in the onion family. So seedlings are, in general, are the easiest. They're slightly more money because you're going to go to a garden center or a box store to buy them. But you also have a lot less choice. You're going to buy the variety that is being sold or is being grown by the garden center. Seeds are definitely the cheapest. They are a little bit more work, but really no more work if you're direct sowing. And that's, you're putting some carrot seeds and you're just drawing a furrow in the ground and planting those seeds. That's no more work at all. But you've got a much larger choice of varieties. And I can't emphasize that enough. You only have to go online to any one of the seed companies that I'll show you later to see how many more varieties are clearly available. The other good value of some of the seed companies is, as you can see in the bottom left-hand corner, is Renee's Garden is a particular seed company I like. It's from America, but a lot of the garden centers sell their seeds. In one packet, there are multiple varieties. As you can see there, there's golden beets, white beets, red beets, and then the striped beet that's in the middle there that you'll see. And that's all in one packet. So you get a choice to try a number of varieties in a single packet. You're going to want to direct sow seeds for quicker growing plants and those with large taproots. Things like, as I've said here, radishes, salad greens, although you can start some of these a little bit earlier indoors. Peas, beans, carrots, turnips, you're not going to see an awful lot of difference by growing them earlier indoors and then transplanting them. And generally, you won't see too many of those in the garden centers. You're going to see things like cabbages and cauliflowers and broccoli and kale and stuff, maybe the odd leeks as well. Zucchini and squash, because they're part of the squash family, don't particularly like being transplanted unless they've been in a large container. And there isn't an awful lot of benefit of growing things like carrots and Swiss chard earlier and then transplanting them. And of course, seed potatoes are going to go directly into the soil. The slow growing plants, or slower growing, I would say are likely the easiest ones if you're a new gardener to go out and buy seedlings or transplants from a box store or a local garden center. So things like tomatoes and peppers and leeks, broccoli, Brussels and cauliflower and stuff that I've mentioned. The downside is you're just not going to get a lot of choice. Maybe in tomatoes and peppers, you might have 3 and 4 different varieties, but usually on many of the other vegetables, you'll be lucky if you just get one variety. The other thing I'll also say is be careful what you buy, that it is suitable for our growing season and our location. We don't have a particularly long growing season, and don't assume that the box store especially knows what they're selling. They often have very little choice in it. When you're buying seedlings and transplants, give some consideration to how they've been stored. If it's inside a greenhouse, especially at a garden center, you're going to want to harden them off. If they've been left outside, you may be okay. But these young plants are certainly prone, and they're more prone than even seed, to frost and heat damage. So just take your time and over a 3 to 5 day period, slowly harden them off, bring them outside. If you just plant them directly outside, you may lose some plants otherwise. Yeah, as I've mentioned here, just when you're buying plants, just check they're suitable. One good example of that are things like parsnips and even leeks. They're some of the longest growing vegetables that you can buy. And if you're not careful, you can easily buy leeks and parsnips that are 120 days. And unless you're starting them indoors, it's far too long of a period. One thing I get asked regularly is about garden seeds. There are no GMO garden seeds sold in Canada. They're only for commercial growers and farmers. So all of the seeds that you buy, whether it's in your local Canadian Tire or Walmart or your local garden center, they're all non-GMO. You don't have to worry. And all seeds are organic. Having gone through a whole bunch of seed companies recently, you'll see many of them talk about non-GMO seeds. You'll see some of them say they're organic. But unless they're coated, all seeds are organic. And you still can get some coated seeds that are organic. So that's the only time you need to be paying any attention to. If you're very keen and your seeds must be organic, then if they're coated, do a double check on them. They often coat seeds. Sometimes they'll bundle 3 and 4 seeds into a pellet, and then they'll coat the pellet. Things like peas are often coated because there is a tendency for peas, if you're planting them directly into the soil in wet conditions, that they'll rot. And so they apply a small coating on the outside to help protect them.
Colin, I just have a question here.
Sure.
From Nicole, she's asking, is there a specific way to harden off? For example, a day for 2 to 3 hours a day, or yeah, how do you harden off?
So precisely, it's a very good question. So just gently take the plant outside, if they've been, certainly if they've been inside a greenhouse at a garden center, then I would just gradually take them out. Don't put them in direct sunlight to start with, but gradually expose them to the ambient conditions of light and heat and sun or cold for 1 to 2 hours a day, then 2 to 4 hours a day. And so if you do that over a 4-day period, those plants by the end of the 4 days will be more than ready to go into the ground. But also give some thought to what's the next week's weather's like. You certainly don't want to give them full impact on the sun. The sun and the heat could certainly burn them. You don't want them to be drenched and swamped with rain or heavy frosts as well. So there is a little bit of practical common sense that you have to apply to the conditions. So I can't give you a hard and fast rule. I wish I could, it would be a lot simpler, but you do have to apply a little bit of common sense to the outside conditions and where they've come from. I hope that helps.
And then we have another question from Becky. She's asking, how do you know if seeds are coated?
So they will tell you. So if you buy a coated seed, the packet will clearly label it. It's one of the benefits of going online. I'll get into the seed companies right now, but having a look at them, if you go to places like Early's and T&T Seeds, West Coast Seeds, their online catalogs are very good, and they usually give you even more information that's on the seed packet. And they will tell you if they're coated. They will specifically tell you if they're coated and still organic. And if they don't, if they tell you they're coated and it doesn't say then they're organic, they will not be.
All right.
Any other questions?
No, we just have a comment from Kathy who says they saw no GMO seeds that spruced up today and they were labeled as such.
Okay. All right.
All right.
All right. So seed catalogs. So most of us gardeners love receiving the seed catalogs. Once you give them your address, you'll get them for the next 40 years, I can assure you. I think I still get, there's one here that's not down there, is Stokes, and I still get Stokes catalogs, and I don't think I've bought anything from them in 20 odd years. The ones I put up here, so if you go online, I'm going to tell you there are hundreds of seed companies in North America. I tend to prefer Canadian seed companies. I mean, shipping is usually a little bit easier and less costly. But you still have the problem of those companies are located in like West Coast Seeds in BC, Faces is in PEI, and Early's is in Saskatchewan. No, T&T Seeds are from Manitoba, so they are the prairie seeds. So you have to still be careful about the days to maturity of a seed. But these are the common seeds. Anything that I highlight, whether it's a variety of a plant, I've generally used or would recommend. Having said that, I have used Wild Rose Heritage Seeds, and a number of the garden centers sell them. There is absolutely nothing wrong with things like Mackenzie, Burpee, and Mr. Fotheringills, which I think is a UK one. Burpees from the States, and you'll see often them in places like Home Depot, Canadian Tire, Home Hardware. Those seeds are perfectly good. They're certainly no better or no worse. I've grown many of them. So those are some of the common seed catalogs, Faces, Early's, and T&T that I like to use. So just a couple of tips for when you're buying seeds. And I've fortunately put up a couple that I can help explain here. You certainly want to be looking for seeds that are less than 75 days. So if you take a look at a couple of the seeds, on the one on the left, the tomato plant, you'll see 65 to 70 days. And that doesn't concern me at all. And I'll start my tomato plants probably in March indoors. And then you'll see this celeriac from West Coast Seeds. It's 110 days. So you don't want to be putting a seed like that in the ground in May long weekend time. It just won't develop enough. I'll start that celeriac seed inside probably in the beginning of March and then transplant it out, given the days to maturity. So you're going to find on these seed packets a reference to F1, OP, and Heirloom. So fortunately, the 3 seed packets I've put here. So this tomato plant is F1, which donates. It's a F1 hybrid, which has had 2 parent plants cross-pollinated deliberately to make a hybrid plant. And usually those hybrid plants are better than the 2 parent plants. And as you can see one here, if you actually read the information on the front of that Faces packet, it says tolerance to tobacco mosaic virus. And usually the crosses are designed to give you either more production or a greater tolerance to a pest or a disease. Heirloom plants, so the dill in the middle here is designated an heirloom dill. Unfortunately, in the seed world, there's no single definition. So what one company calls an heirloom, another company may not. But generally, heirloom plants are considered plants that have been grown for generations and are known varieties pre-1950. Some will go back even older than that with a definition, but around about 1950, there was a starting of a lot more of hybridization of plants to develop the better qualities of them. And then you get open pollination. Open pollination is basically, as it says, they're not naturally pollinated plants that reliably reproduce generation after generation. The difficulty is that all heirloom plants are open pollinated. Not all open pollinated plants are heirloom. So it gets a bit complicated at times. The other question that you need to know, and I get asked, is can you save seeds from hybrid plants? So if I took the tomato plant on the seeds on the left and grew those seeds, and I wanted to dry them out from one of the fruits at the end of the season and to grow next year, I can do that, and I'll grow a tomato plant from it. However, it will not necessarily come out to be a cobra tomato plant. It will likely grow out as being one of their parent stocks, and you'll never know which one of that it will be, but it will unlikely be the hybrid variety. And that's the big difference. If you save seeds from heirlooms and open pollinated, you're going to get the exact same plant that you grew previously. Any questions?
Yeah, we have one from Debbie. She's asking, is there any benefit to buying coated seeds? What is the coating for?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, sometimes some companies will coat them to combine 2 or 3 seeds together. I know I bought some lettuce seeds last year from West Coast Seeds, in fact, and they were a mix of seeds designed to be able to put one pellet in a container, but I would grow a variety of lettuces in that one small container. I also mentioned that sometimes you will find seeds that are being coated, particularly to stop damp, or fungal diseases or bacteria from particularly affecting those seeds. There are certain seeds, things like peas and beans, can be a bit prone to damp conditions. It is nicer to plant them when the ground is a bit drier. And sometimes the coatings are usually designed to give that plant a little bit of extra protection at the start. And there are certainly lots of coatings that are these days are organic. So I don't worry too much about them. If they're not organic, I probably wouldn't buy them. But that's my preference.
Okay. Yep, that's all the questions for now.
Sorry, I'll go back to there. I've forgotten. And, you know, you may pay $3 and $4 for some of these seed packets, but you can certainly save seeds. You know, the average seed packet of carrot seeds, it'll have 1,000 seeds in, unless it's a really specialized hybrid. And then in our climate, we're very fortunate. We've got dry humidity. If you keep the seeds clean and just reseal it, most of the seeds will easily keep for 2 to 4 years. I certainly keep a ton of seeds that I've had for longer than just last year, 2 to 3 years easily. And that's why you'll also see on the packets where usually when I get them, I will write a date on them. If I remember, the Renee's one doesn't have one there, but it's just usually helpful to put a year on when you bought them. You might get some slightly less production from one year to another. All right, so some fundamentals that it is important to know here. Average frost-free days. And this is I got this from National Gardening Association, whatever that is. And there's our frost-free days is only 81 days. And it is significantly less than Calgary, which surprised me. Now, I've no idea whereabouts in Calgary it's taken. Wouldn't surprise me if it was the airport or something on the northeast side. But if you take a look at that, there's a good 30 days less frost-free days here in Okotoks than in the Calgary region. So give that some consideration. If you're planting things like tomatoes, cucumbers, any of those more delicate plants and seedlings outside, and it's the first week of June, you better be prepared for some frost. I'm always careful now after the last couple. I've had some mistakes myself. I'm very, very careful. I try to grow squashes ahead of time, even though they don't like being transplanted. And I can tell you that we definitely have had a frost here in the first week of June on a number of occasions. So be careful of those. And then the June the 10th is the last frost date, and the August the 30th is when you can expect the first frosts to occur. So the May long weekend is still a reasonably good guide to start planting out what I would refer to as the hardier plant seeds. You might even, if your ground's available, you might even get it a week or two earlier if you're lucky and fortunate. But what you're trying to avoid is seeds sprouting earlier and then you get a hard frost, and that's what will kill the seedling off. So if those seeds stay below ground and they take a bit longer to germinate, like things like carrots and beets, then it works out very well. You don't want to be putting out plants out there unless you're prepared to cover them. You have them under row covers. Even row covers right now, I would say, is not a good thing for that time of the year. Late May, June, early June, you can certainly plant out your seed potatoes. You might even get away with putting them a little bit earlier. The worst thing that will usually happen with growing potatoes, if they do sprout, you'll get some browning of the potato leaves, usually on the edges, unless it's a really heavy frost. And you can usually just cut those and trim those dead leaves off. Don't take the whole leaf, just cut the brown bit off, and then they'll survive. I've certainly had frost hit seed potatoes before as they've come pushed through the ground. Mid-June, again, you want peas, beans, and squash to come through after that. You can put the pea seeds in a little bit earlier, but you don't want to be putting any plants in until after those first frosts. Squashes and tomato plants hate it. They just don't do well in any signs of frosts at all. Sow the small fine seeds in a furrow. Just dig a small V-shaped furrow into the ground. Larger seeds tend to want to go into hills, so things like squashes, which are like a very melon pumpkin type seed, they usually grow to develop a hill and put 3 or 4 seeds into that particular hill, and they'll do very well. You want to maximize sowing. So the picture on the right is a good idea of what they refer to as square foot gardening. And it's really just sectioning off your area to maximize what you grow. I know we all have a tendency, I still do a lot of planting in rows, but rows were really just designed for commercial harvesting. So you could bring a tiller or a tractor along and harvest in rows. Sometimes growing in square foot design like this will maximize what you grow. Growing in rows, if you haven't gardened before though, is a big help. So you know what is a weed versus the weeds will grow all over the place, and what you've grown in the row is the peas or beans that are ever coming up. And I mention that because after gardening for so many years, I take weeds for granted, and you sort of know them and you know your plants. But new gardeners sometimes struggle with what's a weed and what's a transplant that comes up, because the young transplants don't always look identical to the plant that is in the seed that you're growing. Any new questions?
Nope, not yet.
Okay, so I'm going to do a very quick slide on composting. I'm certainly not going into the detail of that Elaine Rood did in fall of this year. She's from the Calgary Heart Society and has a great background in the details of this. But given that we have such a lot of clay soils in Alberta, one of the best conditioners that you can do to amend that soil is have a compost pile. I've had a compost pile forever. I just couldn't think of not having one. It just seems to be the simplest thing for me to do. It's a slow-acting fertilizer. It's an all-around conditioner. You can't overdo it. In Agricultural Canada, when I was looking up on compost, they refer to it as compost improves the physical and biological condition of the soil and supplies major and minor plant nutrients. I mean, for me, what could be better? It just sounds, obviously you're getting a lot of conditioning in your soil, and there's a lot of minerals in clay soil. It's just so heavy and wet and very difficult to garden. So you want to be able to break that up. In terms of size of compost, this photograph is probably ideal. You can make it out of chicken wire or 1x6s, but a 4x4, two 4x4 piles are very good. Bigger is always better. As I mentioned earlier, I'm in a typical suburban house. I don't have the room for that, so I've got a couple of these black square things. They're not great. They take longer, they're smaller, but they still break down. It just takes a bit more time. The fundamentals of it is basically you just want to add layers. And the layers are green and brown. If you do any reading on composts, you'll always see green and brown, but you'll occasionally see black as well. So it's green for nitrogen, brown for the carbons, and black for soil. So if you've got any clays that you're digging out, put a layer of the clay soil over the top of the green and black, and it will help break the clay down and keep it moist as well. Don't worry about ratios. You're going to see the minute anybody looks up composting, you're going to see a whole bunch of ratios on nitrogen to carbon ratios. If I remember right, it's something like 30-to-1 carbon to nitrogen ratios. Don't worry about it. Compost whatever you've got, ideally in layers. By having two at the side, as in the picture, is the fact that you can always, if you just put some too much greens on, throw some in the other compost and you can add them later. It also helps you when you've got to aerate and stir and move the compost around a little bit. But anything basically goes in the compost. As it says, the nitrogen plants help speed the decomposition. Compost is a combination of bacterial and fungicidal breakdown, if I remember right. So garden plants, grass in thin layers. I don't have much grass on my property at all. I've got a postage stamp, but grass can choke and slow things down a little bit if you've got too big of a property and lots of grass. Corn cobs, tea leaves, coffee grinds, eggshells, in general vegetable waste will all go in as the nitrogen component of a compost. For the brown component, you can certainly put lots of fall leaves in there, straw, paper and cardboard if you shred it. Wood ash and dry lint will go in there. And as I said, for the black, clay in any soil to go over the top really helps. Clay is a complex mixture of minerals and particles and organic matter. And so it really actually helps them to retain the moisture. So you just want to be able to keep it moist and stir it occasionally. You know, when I say stir, so stir or just move things from the outside to the inside, and it will just help to break it down quicker. The more you break up and cut up and shred that you put on it, the faster it will mature for you. You can buy commercially available starter accelerator products, but they're not essential. It's really a personal choice. I would generally say avoid weeds, especially invasive weeds like bellflowers. And so don't put the the seed heads in with, they've got, you know, flowers. And I'd even avoid the roots, to be honest with you, especially with things like bellflowers. Commercial industrial composters are hugely different. You know, they generate so much heat that they destroy those seeds and any roots. A residential compost rarely gets to the temperatures you need in order to be able to destroy those seeds. So for me, it's just easy to put it in your green bin and let the industrial composter do its business there. It should generally smell earthy. If you're smelling ammonia, which I have never done in 40 years of having a compost, then you've probably got too much nitrogen. It may be a little bit too wet, and you're losing that nitrogen instead of it going into the compost. Don't use pet or human waste. Sorry, now I'll go back. Whoops. They can certainly contain parasites and pathogens. You're going to be putting this into your garden and growing vegetables from it. Do not do that. Avoid kitchen waste, such as meat bones and dairy products. And you know, yes, some of those will definitely break down, but it stops things like mice and rodents. And I hear we're getting more and more raccoons into the Alberta these days. So, you know, just avoid that and you'll avoid some problems. Okay, before I move on, any questions?
No.
All right, so now I'm going to start on the vegetables and I'll move through them, and just please shout if I've missed anything as I go through them. So the allium family is the onions and shallots, leeks and garlic. They're probably one of the easiest of the vegetables to grow here in Alberta, and they don't really get many pests or diseases. We're quite fortunate. So this is when you actually have a third choice in terms of seeds or transplants. You'll also be able to get sets as well. And sets are basically dormant onions or dormant shallots, usually from the previous year, that you can just plant in the ground. They're very small, usually around about 1 to 2 centimeters in size, depending on the type of whether it's an onion or a shallot. The problem with them, and I've used sets for 40 plus years. They're very good, they're very easy, but you rarely get a choice of the variety. Certainly some of the bigger seed companies, but I've tended to buy my sets from some of the box stores and even some of the garden centers. You don't know what variety of plant that you're planting. Seeds and transplants are definitely less likely to bolt than sets. Sets are a little bit further ahead, so when you put them in and the sun comes up, they do have a tendency to bolt a little bit. From a fertilizing perspective, I recommend just applying a granular fertilizer of 10-10-10. So I'll talk a little bit more about fertilizer at the end of the presentation. and then again in 30 days. They are big feeders, especially on some of the larger onions. And in this picture here on the right, you can see these are some onions that were grown up at the community gardens last year. You can see some white bulbs that are, they're called scapes, and they're from the flower head and seed head. And you want to be able to actually stop the plant flowering. So if you see the plant going to flower, cut them off. And then all that energy is going back into and staying in the plant and in the bulb, rather than into developing a flower and a seed for next year's crop. A couple of recommended crop varieties to grow is Ailsa Craig. It's a very famous onion that's been grown for years. I'm trying Calibra this year from West Coast Seeds, so it's not highlighted because I don't have any history with it or experience, but I'm giving it a try. Leeks are easy to grow. They're not difficult. The big challenge with leeks, unfortunately, is finding varieties that don't take more than 110 or 120 days. And these are two varieties. I know you can buy the Chinook from West Coast Seeds. I buy them every year, and I have a great amount of success with them, and I highly recommend them. But even those 65-day leeks, I start in fact, I'll start them in the first 2 weeks of February in order to get them. And the picture on the right is, you can see me, I think it's the last third of my leeks that I'm harvesting in the middle of October, after we've had some snow last year. Shallots, again, I have grown from sets for an awful lot of years. The picture that has just come up is some Zabroon that I grew from seed last year. And I have to tell you that they were best shallots I've ever grown, and I'll be growing them again this year. They were very, very good, and they've kept exceedingly well. Garlic, I guess I know garlic's very popular. I don't have a lot of experience. It's a lot of years before I've grown them. There's two basic types, hardneck and softneck varieties. They're generally best planted in the fall. They're a perennial, and so their bulb likes a cold season to get the best growth out of them. And generally, the onion family is pest-free. You'll see some references to onion maggots. I've never, ever had any. They reference using of row covers, so protection over it, and keeping the soil dry and just holding off on the fertilizer. It's getting lush leaves and plants and wet conditions that sort of encourage the onion maggot. But as I said, I've never had any, and I don't know of any of my fellow gardeners up at the garden centre that have them either. The one thing I didn't talk about here are things like bunching onions and green onions. They're certainly very easy to grow. You can get the sets in almost any garden centre, and you'll have no difficulties in growing them. You just want to pick them before they flower, otherwise the stalks can get a little bit tough. All right.
I have a question here from Althea. They're asking, should you put horse or cow manure in the compost bin?
So I would say you shouldn't, unless if you're going to be using horse or cow manure, then generally if you're going to be putting it on vegetables, if you've got it available and sure it's a good natural fertilizer, ideally put it on your compost in the fall, and so it's got 6 months to age and mature before you put it in your compost. There are certain vegetables like potatoes in particular come to mind that do not like fresh manure at all. It will work very well if it's broken down. Some of the other problems with horse manure as well I do know is that people always complain that seeds seem to go through them, so you end up getting an awful lot of weeds into your the vegetable patch. So I don't have an awful lot of experience with it, but generally speaking, I wouldn't apply fresh manure to any vegetables. And I think later in my slideshow, I think I make a reference that they've got to have at least 4 months before you're going to eat those vegetables. Okay, so I'm going to get a move on because I've got still a lot to get through here. Mark's just giving me a heads up. Beets, again, one of the easiest of any vegetable to grow. The seeds are a little bit funny, so I've tried to show a photograph of them on the left-hand side. They're called multi-germ or dried fruit seeds. And each one of those seeds actually contains 2 to 3 seeds. So be generous when you're digging your furrow and planting them. And every seed packet, I forgot to mention, but every seed packet will tell you how to space the seeds out and the depth of the seed to go into the soil. But because beets are multi-germ seeds, you're going to need to thin them out. So you may end up with, 5 plants very, very close together, and you'll never get a decent size beet. So, after they come through the soil, in 3 or 4 weeks, start thinning them out into the rough size of the beet size. They don't like, the one particular strangeness about beets is they don't like the soil crusting over. So if you've had a lot of dry sun and it's trying to sprout, they will struggle breaking through the crust of the soil. So an old tip is to use the back of the rake just to break up the back of the soil, and it'll also help manage the weeds at the same time. There are a lot of very, very good varieties of beets. Detroit Dark Red has been going for decades, and I always plant some. Merlin and Burr are other varieties that I've used. Foreman Over is a sort of almost carroty shaped. And the Boulder and the Touchstone are golden beets that you can see in the top right-hand corner. I tend to find that a lot of the colored beets are slightly smaller in shape. You can certainly eat the tops in the salad. So if you're going to harvest the tops while the beet is still growing, take no more than about 1/3 of the leaves. And that's usually a pretty good way to manage that you won't damage it. Avalanche is another good variety. I'm a little bit, it's a white variety, and there's the Georgia, which is the candy striped beet. I'm not particularly a lover of those 2 particular varieties because I think they discolor very easily once you take the skin off them and prepare them for a meal. Pests, they're definitely prone to flea beetles at the early stage. So as the plant breaks through the ground, they get a couple of early leaves on. Certainly up north, we got a lot of flea beetles, and we certainly can get them down here. I like to use row covers over them, certainly at the early stage. It doesn't damage the plant once the plant is matured, but they can be devastating. In fact, they're very, very small beetles, and that's why they're called flea beetles. But you can also use diatomaceous earth just to sprinkling. It's basically diatomaceous earth is a fossilized organic silica compound that's been pulverized. It's from clays from riverbeds, I believe. And they just grind up into an earth, and it dissuades the flea beetles to go somewhere else. And then the other thing is to use things like marigolds as companion planters and onions. They actually are very good at dissuading. Not a lot of bugs seem to like the onion family. Questions? Okay, I'm going to move on. Try to get through them quickly here. Again, another one of the easiest vegetables to grow. direct sow the seeds 3 to 4 weeks before the last frost. So, you know, there's certainly no problems with putting in some carrot seed if you've got the ground available at the May long weekend. There are lots of seeds in a packet, as I mentioned before. There's certainly some of the common carrot seeds. You've got 2,000 seeds, and so a lot. Don't try to count out all the seeds. You can sow quite and then thin them out later and eat them as fresh vegetables, as they're very small. Like full sun, well-drained soil, and you want to be able to have the soil, in reasonably good shape if you're digging over to at least a spade depth. So I tend to recommend shorter, stubbier, fattier type of carrots varieties. And there's tons of varieties of carrots out there, different shapes, sizes, colors. To be honest, I tend to stay away from some of these white, purple, and yellow ones. They tend to be thin and long and skinny, which don't work particularly well in our clay soils. So I think you're putting in more effort with less produce at the end of it. I could recommend the fat, shorter, cylindrical types, the Chantenays, Nantes, Danvers. All of those are very good. The ones in the picture there are Kuroda that I chose last year, and they worked out very well. Any questions? I think that's all on the carrots.
Nope.
Okay, so I put the mustard family in here, and I'll be very honest with you. I think this is the one of the more difficult vegetables to grow. I've included it because I know definitely people like to grow things like cabbage and kale, possibly broccoli as well. But it is the family of vegetables that has the biggest problems with pests and soil-borne diseases. So things like cutworms, slugs, root maggots, white rust, and downy powder and mildew. Row covers helps, and they certainly do to help cut down the things like cutworms and slugs and caterpillars. Even it actually helps a little bit with the downy mildew because you're getting a little bit of protection from the row cover. But it's important that you change locations each year if you can. There's certainly more problems with that. I'll tell you the easy ones. So kale and kohlrabi are probably the easiest. Lois Hole recommends if you're trying to get children interested in gardening, get them to plant some kohlrabi. They're very easy plants to grow, and they look like something from outer space. And they're very simple and not fussy, and less prone to pests than most of the mustard family. Cabbages, there's plenty of cabbages around. I really recommend here going for some of the hybrid varieties. They're generally superior these days. You're getting better yields out of them, better resistance to pests and weather conditions. The cabbage in the top right was a Chinese cabbage that I was given last year and tried. Had no bugs at all on the outside because I grew them under row covers, but it doesn't stop the slugs growing into the bottom. So the outside leaves got chewed away, but that particular cabbage kept enormously well and was just a super cabbage to grow, and I'll probably grow some more again this year. So some of the Oriental varieties are much better to grow here because they're actually more tolerant to some of our hot summers. Broccoli you can certainly grow, but it's also a bit prone to a few of the pests above and bolting and drying out. Then, if you don't keep them just moist, then the flower heads delay on you. I generally don't recommend Brussels and cauliflowers. Both of them are cool weather growing plants. They prefer the cool weather. Cauliflower just hates changing weather. So it hates the changing temperatures. It hates changing moisture conditions. They like very stable conditions. If you want to have the flower to retain its whiteness, you've got to make sure that the leaves are folded over to keep them blanched. They're just a bit more work. So it's not that you can't. There's certainly lots of kale and cabbage varieties that you can grow, but they do also take some space and also give some thought to, if you're growing them, they may all come due together as well. So are you going to be able to manage 6 or 7 cabbage plants? I mention it because it's one of the few things when I see people growing at the community gardens that you'll see 1 or 2 have been harvested, and then a number of them have just been left and gone to seed. If there's no questions, I'm going to go on.
I do have one question here. How do you keep them from bolting?
So 2 preferred methods is row covers really help because row covers temper the sun, and I'll show you some pictures of row covers towards the end. But also choosing varieties that are less prone to bolt. So if you go onto the seed company's websites, they will usually indicate those plants that are less prone to bolting, and bolting, for those that don't know, is the plant is going to seed early. So hot, dry weather has a tendency to do that. Keeping them a little bit moist will help, but that's the other reason for choosing some of those Oriental Chinese cabbage varieties and bok choy, and those are very good alternatives. Okay, so peas. Peas and beans are some of the easiest plants to grow. And I don't know anybody who, if you're picking your peas at harvest time, won't pop a few into the mouth, and if they feel like they just taste like popcorn, it's just awesome. There are tons and tons of varieties. I can't simply go through enough of the varieties today. The one thing I will say to you is, if you're building pole beans or peas that are grow up high on a vine, and you've got to put up some supports, as in the pictures, give some thought to your location in the garden. Certainly, I saw some examples last year of peas growing over 6 feet, collapsing because the support structure in the garden wasn't supportive enough. And then also they were shedding a lot of shade on next vegetables in the garden. So put them at the end of your garden somewhere that's not casting shade on everything. Direct sow seeds prior to the last frost, beans just a little bit later, and you'll have no problems. Just be careful that the soil's not too wet. Damp, moist is fine. They don't like a lot of fertilizer, so compost is a very good choice for peas and beans. Otherwise, the peas especially, they'll grow an awful lot of shoots and very few flowers. So just lightly fertilize them and harvest often, and it'll actually help increase the yield. And any old pods that have been left or died, take them off as well. You don't want any of the energy going into making seed. You want it going into making new seeds. Dig plants into the ground after harvesting. So peas and beans, they're heavy nitrogen feeders, and they also recommended fixing the ground for nitrogen. So don't plant peas and beans in the same location in the following years. You'll end up being deficient in certain minerals. It is a very good idea to put your potatoes where your peas were the previous year. It's an ideal match. But there's pole varieties, there's bush varieties, And the bush varieties tend to be a little bit easier. You don't need all of the supports that you're growing, but just be careful which varieties that you pick. And there's just so many. It's unbelievable the types of number of beans that you can get these days available. I'm going to hit potatoes if there are no questions, because I know potatoes are always a love of vegetable gardeners. Potatoes like acidic soil, so you can help that by adding peat moss, and even as it says there, some spruce needles just to increase it. And crop rotation is essential, especially in this area, because we have, and it's actually throughout Alberta, there is a fair amount of scab in the area. And when I first moved to Okotoks, it was one of the very first things that I walked down to the community garden in downtown, and one of the old gardeners there mentioned to me that they don't grow potatoes anymore because of the prevalence of scab. So scab in this right-hand picture are those small brown blemishes that you can see here that I'm just pointing out. It does not hurt the plant. It is on the surface skin of the plant. The potato is perfectly intact inside, so it's very superficial. It just doesn't look particularly great. So what you want to be able to do is choose varieties that are scab resistant. So the red potato on the right is a Norland. It's an early potato variety, and you usually find potatoes in three. They're usually labeled as late varieties, so September time frame, a medium variety that's available mid to late August, and early varieties at the beginning of August time frame, or maybe slightly earlier. But the longer they are left in the ground and the more contact that they have with the scab bacteria, then the more scab that they're going to have. So these were lifted in probably mid-August, and they've got a little bit on it. It's an early variety potato. I just don't recommend things like Yukon Golds and Red Pontiacs are known for being very problematic with scabs, so stay away from them. Probably one of the best potatoes I've ever grown is the French Fingerling. It's not the characteristic really thin potato. It's more sort of like a russet shape. But they are some of the best potatoes I've ever grown. They're a little bit more difficult to get, and you'll usually be able to buy the potato seeds for them at garden centers. But again, because they're left in the ground for a long time, you will see scab on them. Before the harvest, you want to be able to wait for the tops to brown and die off before harvesting them. Don't harvest too early. You can certainly take some. There's nothing wrong with sticking your hand under the ground and taking a few seed potatoes from each of the plants. It certainly doesn't hurt. Or if you're wanting to harvest them, but you're going to dig a furrow. Sorry, I'm going to go up there. You're going to dig a furrow about a spade depth. Put the seed potato in, so the seed potato is on the left. You can cut that seed potato in half, as long as you've got about 2 to 3 eyes on the potato, and just and get 2 seed potatoes out of it, and then slowly hill them up as the plant starts to shoot up through this soil, and cover them up so that the seed potatoes don't get exposed to sun. If they get exposed to sun, then they will go green on you. Any questions on potatoes before I get into tomatoes?
Yep. There's one from Vivian who says, should you use a certain potato to plant in containers?
It really doesn't matter. So you can pick any one of those potatoes. If you put them in a container and you're not using any soil from your garden, and you're using compost and a bit of peat moss or whatever, you're not going to get any scab, so you don't have to worry about it. It's a really good idea to do a potato grow bag. You'll get a lot of potatoes out of one bag. but you've got the choice, I think, if you're growing in a container. And any one of those, I think, would be very good. And I'd highly recommend the French fingerlings and the Norlands, which are an early, and I've grown them for a lot of years. Hope that helps.
And then there's just one more question. Do potatoes need to be supported?
No, they don't. Not at all. You just hill up as they start to come up, so that they've got plenty of soil around the base of the plant, but they don't require any support at all. And obviously the later ones flower a little bit later than the early ones, and no other work to do with them. It certainly it wouldn't hurt to add a bit of fertilizer of, something like a 10-10-10, a granular at the beginning of the year. But as I said as well, they also benefit from planting them where peas and beans have been planted the year before. Okay, tomatoes. So tomatoes love heat and they hate wind. So if you're going to grow tomatoes outside, not in a greenhouse, the more protection you can give them up against a fence, up against a wall, the better they will be. They will grow up at the gardens, community gardens, definitely, but you'll have a ton more produce from them, and tomatoes will ripen on the vine better if you just give them a little bit of protection. It makes such a huge difference. I can't emphasize that enough. Plant out only after the last frost. So keep an eye on those temperatures. And at the end of the year, in August time, if you know you've still got a lot of green tomatoes on, you want to last them a lot, be prepared to cover them as well. Some old blankets or something, or a tarp will even help. If you're transplanting out and you're buying plants, plant the entire stem up to the first leaves in the ground. That stem will develop healthy roots and you'll get a much better plant out of it at the end of the day. You're buying plants in a garden center, don't always look for the ones that have already got flowers on or already got fruit on them. They're not always going to give you the best results. Buy something that's very green and very healthy looking. Suckers. So doesn't matter which variety of plant, you want to remove those first suckers before the first flowers. So if they're growing any shoots at the bottom of the plant or from the stems, remove them up until the very first flower on the plant. And you'll end up again with better, a healthier plant and a better producing plant. Tomatoes are big feeders. They like water and they want it regularly, not intermittently. So if you're going to give water them, if they're in the ground, you can probably water them every 2 to 3 days. If they're in a container, you may have to water them daily. I grow my my tomatoes in grow bags inside a greenhouse. I water my tomato plants every day. And I feed them with fertilizer 20-20-20. There are a bunch of different fertilizers. You'll see different mixes. 20-20-20 is a balanced fertilizer. It works very well. If you want a slightly higher middle number on the phosphorus, you'll certainly, supposedly get more flowers and more fruit from it. But 20-20-20 is a very good one to remember. There's 2 types of tomato plants, determinates and indeterminates. So generally referred to as bush type. So you plant the determinate, the bush in the variety, you don't have to do anything more with it. Basically, it's going to grow into a big bush. You're going to need to support it. So they're much less maintenance than the vine types. And I'll talk about the vine types on the next slide. The bush types grow very well in a cage. So go buy a tomato cage or put some stakes around it. But don't just think the cage alone will be good enough. You will almost certainly need to add some stakes to support them. I've grown Romas and Mamma Mia over the years and Sunrise Support, and they can be so prolific and laden with tomatoes that they'll fall over even in a cage. I generally don't grow beefsteak tomatoes ever. So I have, those are very common bush beefsteak, and Primo are very common bush varieties, beefsteaks. Tomatoes, Bush Early Girl is a very common medium-sized variety that's been out for a lot of years that I'd highly recommend. And then for hanging baskets, any of the tumbling varieties. So Tumbler is a variety that's been going for years. Great container. Even a small container, you'll get tons of cherry tomatoes out of them. Highly recommend them. And you'll see some of them there on the right-hand side. I'm going to continue on because we've certainly got quite a bit to still go through. The vine types are going to grow 6 to 12 feet high, and you determine where the height is. So as they start to grow high, you can just nip off certainly you want to nip off the ends of the tomato plants near the end of the season. So you're going to need to stake them or put some sort of a trellis on them for them to grow up. I've shown you a sprout here, a sucker, that on vine tomatoes, this is the edge of a leaf plant, not a flowering plant. You're going to want to nip that out just with your 2 fingers or a cutter, just cut them out. And otherwise you're going to end up with a very large bush instead of a vine, and your production of your plant will be down as well accordingly. So they do need to be pruned, and they need to be pruned, I'm going to almost say every couple of days. You'll be surprised. I'll come into my greenhouse and all of a sudden I've got something that's a foot long and it didn't seem to be there yesterday. So they grow very quickly. Varieties to recommend: Brandywine, I haven't grown it, and Black Krim and Flora America are long outstanding beefsteak varieties that are very, very popular and highly sought after. I know the Black Brandywine in particular is very good beefsteak, although I don't grow it myself. The cherry varieties, I highly recommend Sun Gold. I think it's one of the sweetest orange tomatoes that you'll ever grow, and along with Sweet Million and Sakura is a red one that's just very prolific. The smaller, medium-sized saladette type tomatoes, Counter, Early Girl, Jean Flamme, and Premio are very good. So tomatoes ripen in response to water stress. So as you get towards the end of the season, mid to late August, number of gardeners, I don't, mine is still in my greenhouse, but a number of gardeners start to reduce the watering. If they're in a grow bag, you still need to be watering somewhat. If they're in the ground, you can probably start to stop the watering, and they'll just take the water that's in the ground already. But they will actually ripen the tomatoes sooner for you. And then in late August and early September, you want to start removing flowers, and especially on the vine types that growing anymore, just pinch the top out. And then the plant is going to focus on the fruit that's already there and ripening it and putting the energy into that fruit rather than growing new fruit. Any tomato questions?
No tomato questions, but there was one potato question that we missed. Sherry says, I had a lot of tops in the bag, but 0 potatoes. Any thoughts?
I would almost certainly guess that it sounds almost like too much fertilizer. And so you've got a lot of nitrogen and it's produced an awful lot of that. And it's a typical example of too much fertilizer. But that's the only thing I can that readily comes to mind. Okay. Radishes. So again, they grow very prolifically for the most part. Very easy to grow. You can sow seeds every couple of weeks. It's a good filler plant in as you remove some, put some more in to keep them growing. You want to harvest regularly if you want to keep them relatively mild tasting. Don't like drying out, which can be a challenge in our summertime. Otherwise, they do become a bit woody. Tons of varieties and certainly lots of color. And there's a number of Asian ones that are very spicy. So very simple, easy plant, direct sow them. Turnips and Rutabaga, you know, my advice was eat them while they're small. They can be very prolific. I know I grew some purple top white globes a couple of years ago, and I couldn't believe how many I ended up in the size of them. And, I mean, I certainly actually couldn't use them all, and fortunately the local food bank was more than willing to take them. The orangey ones, that are here in front of the Sean Boole, very good, nice sized rutabaga. Don't have a lot of problems. A bit like the beets, they tend to be very prone to flea beetles, but usually only a problem. And you can see if you look on the right hand side, a few holes in the leaves. It doesn't really kill the mature plant. You just want to stop the flea beetles on the young plants. They'll continue to grow. I'm going to move on because of the time here. Salad greens, again, another easy, low maintenance vegetable. You know, there are so many varieties of lettuces out there these days. I highly recommend, you know, the butter crunchers. There's an Esmeralda variety that I bought for years from Early's out of Saskatchewan. There's just so many different varieties. And the nice thing, if you know, growing leaf lettuce, you don't need to pick the whole lettuce. You can trim the tops of them. You can pick a few leaves, and the plant will continue to grow. And you know, you want to be able to successive sow so that they're not all coming together. You know, you end up with a whole bunch of lettuce. But if you just sow a little bit every couple of weeks, you'll have fresh lettuce all through the summer long. And the biggest problem with lettuce is generally bolting and slugs. So if you can keep the slugs away early on by, there are some, you know, safer products that you can buy that will attract the slugs away from them, and put them on early before you see the slugs coming. I'd say that's the biggest one. Spinach is a little bit of a problem because it bolts very easily along with arugula. Arugula also tends to get flea beetles as well, tends to attract them. But the nice thing about the spinach is you can certainly look up. There are certainly slow bolting varieties out there to buy these days, and you'll see them right in the seed catalogs. If you buy some of the baby leaf ones, they're a little bit less likely to bolt on you as well. Lots of them where you can go into the seed catalogs and buy mixes, like mescaline mixes of a variety of seeds. So it's always a nice surprise when you're growing them and you never quite know what you're getting there. Any questions?
No.
Good. Swiss chard, one of the easiest vegetables to grow. And I've never had a problem with them at all. No pests, no bugs. I do grow them under row covers for the most time, so it helps stopping them bolting. Some of them do bolt. Sow seeds near the last frost. The seeds are very like the beet seeds, so they do need to be thinned out as multiple seeds in that multi-germ seed. Very nice varieties that are multicolored, the Bright Lights, Celebration, and Kaleidoscope. where you get a huge variety of colors, and you can eat the tops in salads, and you can use the vegetables as you would use celery in stews or whatever. There's other varieties out there. It's peppermint, isn't peppermint flavored. It's like candy striped, but it's a particularly good one to grow in large containers. Very high in nutritional value. I won't go through all of that if you're not familiar with it, but it's such an easy plant to grow. You can put those seeds in and you'll be eating them relatively early in late July, harvesting them all the way through into September. Okay, zucchini and squash. So, direct sow, yeah. I think I said earlier, I do tend to try to grow them early and then do transplants. I'm not sure I'm ever ahead of the game than the ones I direct seed. I recommend summer squashes. You can certainly grow things like acorn and butternut squashes, and there's one in front of you there, the green. But the amount of produce you get from them is, it's just, there's a lot more effort into growing it for a little reward. The yellow squashes there are scallopinis, sometimes called patty pans. Restaurants like to sell them in a very small stage. I usually let them grow much larger and then harvest them. And I'm still eating them. I've still got some in the pantry. They keep, even though they're a summer squash, they still keep exceedingly well. Zucchini, which is a summer squash. I like to grow some of the golden ones, as you can see in the photograph. I tend to find that they don't grow as big, and I'm not eating zucchini all summer long in everything. The green ones can be prolific some years. Don't know what it is about zucchinis. You certainly have some years where they just grow and become huge, and then other times they're a little bit quieter in terms. And last year, it was what seemed to be one of those years for some reason. It certainly was hotter and drier. Both require a lot of space, so give that some thought. You don't want to put them under row covers. You want the flowers to be pollinated naturally. You only want to put something over at the end of the year for protection against first frosts. Very easy to grow zucchini, especially. As I said earlier, they don't transplant very well, and I found that they're very pest-free. If the fruit is on the floor and it's a big fruit, you don't want it to spoil. You can certainly put some cardboard or wood underneath it to protect it from the dampness of the soil, spoiling the fruit. Okay, I am going to go a bit quicker just simply because of the time here. I'm cognizant. There are other vegetables you can grow out there. The ones I've gone through are my recommendations for what I call easy vegetables with a high produce and good quality. I won't go through all of these. I'll hit some of the highlights. Cucumbers. I grow cucumbers in a greenhouse every year. It's a vine type summer dance. It is awesome. I don't have to worry about pollination. It's what's referred to as parthocarpic, if I remember right. I have no experience with bush and field cucumbers for pickling. So that's why I put them down here. In general, they're heavy feeders, like tomatoes. Certainly the vine types like a lot of heat as well. Celery is one of those fussy plants. You'll get a good year this year, terrible year the next. I'm never sure why. And they have a lot of a long growing season. The better alternative in many ways might be celeriac if you haven't tried it. It's the root celery plant, but it is also another long growing season. Fennel is very good, grows very well here. It does bolt easily, but row covers really help stopping that. But you need to separate fennel from any of your other vegetables in your garden. Other vegetables don't like it for some reason. I do not recommend peppers, not simply they're far more effort than I think they're worth. I've grown sweet peppers for a number of years. I've grown hot peppers. You'll get some better yields out of the hot peppers, definitely. But when I compare how much effort I have to put into those compared to my tomato plants, then it's just not worth it to me. So I've stopped growing them. And they don't like cold weather at all. So if you're growing them just outside with any protection, you're going to need to put some shelter there. Parsnips, I do grow parsnips. You just got to be aware they take up a lot more room, and the green heads take up a way more room than carrots. They're a very long growing season, so I start my seeds in March, and you need to dig a fairly deep hole with loam soil and compost and my train of thoughts lost there. If it's clay soil, you're going to end up with a parsnip that looks like an octopus at the end of the day. They'll have tentacles going out all over the place. Sweet potatoes don't even bother because our season's just not long enough. And then corn, yes, you can grow them, but for me, they take up a lot of space, and you need to choose your varieties very well. When I look at the community gardens and people grow them, I just don't think they're worth the space personally. Fruits and herbs, I am not going to go into any degree of detail. I would highly recommend raspberries, rhubarb. I think it's two of the easiest. Strawberries take a little bit more work over the years, and you've got to be prepared to keep replacing them a little bit. Saskatoons, certainly very easy to grow. And apple, pear trees, and sour cherry trees. There's Evans sour cherry trees grow all over the place, and they're very, very, very good. If you're going to buy some of the fruit trees, go to the local garden centers and have a conversation with those folks first. Herbs, there's a ton of herbs. A number of mint varieties that grow, chives and garlic chives. I grow a ton of basil every year. A few sage plants that I just leave in my garden and they come back every year. Italian and curly parsleys grow very, very well. Lemon balm grows more than I can use, I think. I just need to find more uses for it. And dill is certainly prolificating. So quickly go through the maintenance. You're going to want to water regularly for most of your vegetables, excluding tomatoes that need a bit more frequency. You're going to want to water deeply once a week. In the hot weather, maybe twice, as I mentioned earlier, containers a bit more frequently. So before you go out and water, weed. I can't stress enough how important it is in the first beginning few weeks of the year, especially we don't procrastinate, don't put it off. If you put it off for 3 and 4 weeks, you potentially can come back to an awful lot of work, and it will affect the quality of the produce that you're gardening and encourage insects too. So weekly and as you're weeding and watering, just look at your plants and see if there's any bugs or any diseases on them. Most of the time, it's just simply too easy to physically remove any bugs. If you've got things like flea beetles or aphids on peas or something, spray them down with a water hose and they'll work very well. In the middle of the summer, you want to be able to thin out things like carrots, beets, and turnips. Fertilizing. So I'm back to the question that was asked earlier, avoid fresh manure. The recommendation in everything I read is need 4 months of any manure put on any vegetable patch before you're going to harvest them. Ideally, it always recommends put it on in the fall of the previous year. Compost is best. You likely don't need much else. Certainly some 10-10-10 fertilizer granular at the beginning of the year won't hurt. I'm hoping most of you know when somebody says 10-10-10, it's 10 parts nitrogen to 10 parts phosphorus, or sometimes you'll see it as phosphate. 10 parts potassium, excuse me. Excuse me. Okay. Any questions?
There is one thing from Dawn who says, masterful presentation, Colin. Thanks for all your work and knowledge, insights, great information and pictures. And then he asks, how can we get access to this recording? So the recording will be emailed out to Garden Club members, and then it will also be posted on Okotoks.ca, so you can just check back, and hopefully within the next week or so it'll be up there.
Okay. So as I said earlier, there are some companion planting. Excuse me. So planting things like marigolds and mint and celery and onions really helps to keep some of the pests away. Up at the community garden, I did have some problems with voles one year eating beets. And a good tip from a local gardener said, if you plant radish around the outside of your plant, the voles will go after those, and it's a good sacrificial crop. When I did that, I never had any more problems with voles, so maybe they don't like the radish. Use of cold frames I highly recommend for getting things like lettuce and spinach started early. Vegetables that are tolerant of frosts. In fact, things like parsnips and some of the cabbages actually benefit from a first frost. They'll sweeten up. It's one of the things with the newer varieties of Brussels as well. Hybrid varieties are actually now sweeter than the traditional heirloom varieties. Keep a journal of what you've planted and when, and when you harvest. It really helps in planning your garden the following year. Crop rotation. So I think this is the third time I've mentioned it helps prevent soil-borne pests and diseases and nutrient deficiencies. Dig over the garden before winter. It used to be a little bit of an old saying that, and I don't think there's a necessity to dig gardens over as much as previously, and I'll be a bit cautious about recommending that now. I think Mike Dorian's presentation will give you a lot more insights in the use of fertilizers and soil preparation. Things have changed a lot in the last few years. Gardening tips. So I'm a big lover of just be careful of first frost protection and at the end of August. If you've got a lot of fruit on vegetables and that's out there, you will have to be careful and throw some blankets over them or add some mulch around them. You know, if you've got zucchini and squashes, putting some straw or newspaper and cardboard around them will really help. Even if it's for 1 or 2 nights, it'll get you a couple of extra weeks of growth. Row covers, I'm a big supporter of row covers. If they're left on the right-hand side and they're just left loose with stones at the edge, they're called floating row covers. You can put hoops underneath them, and I grow all my leeks underneath them, and even some beets these days. And really, they temper the heat and they give some frost protection. You'll see there's usually some 3 ratings. The higher the temperature protection that you get for frost protection, the less light it puts in. So I tend to stick with the middle one and find it works very well. And it tempers the heat, it keeps the soil moist, It prevents bugs and insects going in there other than slugs, and you'll even get some wind and hail protection from them. So most of them I find will last 3 to 4 years, and then you'll have to replace it. They do tear eventually. Common mistakes: not harvesting when it's ready, and you'll see peas and lettuce and Swiss chard wasted in the ground, which is always a shame. Planting everything all at once, and you've got way too much produce that you can manage. So family and friends come in handy sometimes. Then weeds, don't delay. Get into as you're looking at your plants and watering them, weed them every week. It really helps. Planting the incorrect variety for the climate. So as I said, look at those maturity dates, pick the shortest ones. It really helps. Again, I'm just going to stress there's a good example of a lettuce on the left-hand side there that's bolted and gone to seed. Tomatoes, peppers, if you're going to grow them outside, they like protection, especially from the wind. Okay, some references very, very quickly. If you want to learn more, certainly come and join the Okotoks Garden Club. There's a huge number of guest speakers. I'm probably one of the less skilled and less experienced. We've got some folks from the Calgary Garden Club and garden centers that come from the Calgary Horticultural Society, I should say, that come. Very, very knowledgeable speakers. Online, I bet you gardening interests, there are tens of thousands of them online. I like to use, there's a good website called The Rusted Gardener from the States. As long as you temper it and know that it's south of the border and not here. Greenland Gardening Center from Sherwood Park has some excellent videos that they put on regularly. The initial ones they started were, I think, free, and they might have a token payment now for some of them. If you want some cheap plants, then we do have a plant swap and sale, usually in springtime. It was deferred this year, but I think it's highly likelihood that we'll be able to do a social distance one this year. And I usually end up with a bunch of my tomato plants that I will offer to folks there. Books, I really recommend the books that are being specific for the foothills and the prairies and Alberta. Lois Hall's got a whole range of books that probably did more to influence my gardening than anything else. There's certainly the Calgary Gardener, which is, I think one of the part of the authors there was from the Calgary Hort Society. Vegetable Gardening for Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba from Laurie Peters is a very good one that I had out from the library. It's very good. And then the Prairie Gardeners, Go-To Vegetables. Janet Melrose is one of our regular speakers. And the two books on the left-hand side are both there's the Pests and Disease and the vegetable ones from her and Cheryl Norman. But first and foremost, go visit your local garden centers. We've got some excellent garden centers. I can't say enough about them. They are very, very good, and some knowledgeable people at them. So quickly in closing here, it's not difficult. Plant needs they need water, a bit of fertilizer, some sun and attention, and they'll grow, and you'll have some great produce at the end of it all. Try something new, but don't overdo it. It's very much a tendency when you get a seed catalog in front of you to order way more than you'll ever need. But so plan your garden. Visit and talk to the local gardeners, especially at community gardens, are great for that. They'll tell you what they'll recommend or not recommend. Don't get discouraged. Hey, some years it works out and some things they just don't. One thing you can always count on around here though is you will get hail damage. And there's a good crop of rhubarb that was not spoiled, but usable, but certainly had the hail beat it. Have fun and enjoy the fruits of your labor and eat fresh vegetables. There's nothing like it. It's a great hobby. So thank you very much. If you've got any last questions, I will certainly take them. And I think there's just one more slide about the upcoming soil health super soil in February. So any last questions?
Yep, we have a couple last questions. If anybody has any other questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A here quickly. So we have one question. What size of container do you plant tomatoes in?
So you want larger is better. I mean, you can grow them in a 5-gallon container very easily. I know, in fact, all of my tomatoes inside my greenhouse are actually grown in grow bags. They're probably just a little bit bigger than 5 gallons or more. The smaller the container, usually the problem is you're going to water more often. So you can certainly have small containers for things like lettuce and basil or any of the herbs that you want to grow in a container. Tomatoes, you know, the bigger the container, the better. And it just makes things a little bit easier for yourself. If you're growing things like zucchini or squashes, bigger is certainly better. And 5 gallon would be a minimum.
Okay. And then one more question here. Do you leave the row covers on for the whole season or just when the plants are young?
Great question. I leave my row covers on all season long, and I grow all my leeks and beets and sometimes even a few turnip, cabbages underneath them. Last year I grew celeriac underneath them, shallots, and I leave them on all year long. And I never have any problems with insects or diseases, and I think I get a lot of benefit out of them, and I think I end up needing to water my plants a lot less often. It is noticeable by leaving them on how dry the ground is around them, but inside of the row covers, it's far more moist than what's left open to just the sun.
Very good. Yeah, and then we just have a bunch of people in the chat saying thank you, and I want to echo that as well. Thank you so much, Colin. That was a really good talk, and I'm definitely excited to start looking at those seed catalogs and planning for the garden in the spring.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, and I'll just remind everyone, of our upcoming webinar on February 16th. Soil health is the topic with Mike Dorian. And you can register at Okotoks.ca/events.
All right.
So hopefully we'll see everyone there. And yeah.
Have a good
Awesome.
evening. Very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.